I Let's see where to start here. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. May it please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us clarity of thought and presence of mind in this hour for the sake of our discussion and those who listen into it as students of truth, of all truth, and all truth is an expression of Islam. Whether you call yourself Muslim or not, it doesn't make any difference. And it seems to me, dear brother, that we are involved in some component of the revision that's taking place in Islam. And this has been ongoing for quite some time. And I was not really aware of how long it's been going on, this revision. It goes back 50, 60 years to the best of my knowledge. And I haven't really researched it probably as much as you have. Um, in any case, I welcome you again to another hour of this discussion. And I want you to know that I really and truly appreciate your perspective because I'm in several discussions with other people who are looking at the same tree, but from different perspectives. And we're all, you know the analogy of looking at the elephant, and you see a tail, and you see a trunk, and you see these ears, and everybody describes them somewhat differently. But your description is fully academically qualified, and that is an aspect that a lot of people are missing in their purview. And I'm not talking about other academics. Other academics are for the most part, just ignoring these matters and pretending they don't exist. This is a posing that's taking place amongst those who wish to pretend what I call this pretentious piety, you see. And we've rubbed shoulders with these people, and we just have to learn how to get along with them, whether we like it or not. Doesn't make any difference. And they're in their place, and we're in our place. And most of the people who I'm involved with, most of my students and the students of other people that I'm having these discussions with, are not academically oriented. I had one alim who thought he was an academician. He actually attended George Washington University and got some sort of a degree there, and or was it Georgetown? I think it was Georgetown. Yeah, Georgetown. And you know as well as I do that Professor Osman Bakar held chair there for some years, and it's quite it's a learned institution, and he graduated with some degree there, and he came uh, to cross swords with me over a certain um, approach to the Quran, which especially is held by Dr. Hani Achan at the moment, who's done a remarkable job of revision of the language and locution, and is introducing the arcana through the Abrahamic locution, which is uncovering what came before in the previous scriptures, corrupted and not. We're trying to get past the corruption to the truth, to the root, which is called in the Old Testament the root of Jesse, you see. And these things are unknown to most of our brothers. They don't understand and sisters. They don't understand these arcana, and they're not academically oriented. Well, when I crossed swords with this young man who was challenging me on my support of Dr. Achan, I said, okay, well, if you wish to really criticize him, do it in a right way, do it in a correct manner. Take the academic approach. Write me a white paper, okay? And he can't do it, you see. He never did it. What he did was he just took the position of criticism of bits and pieces taken out of contents of what Dr. Hani was presenting, and it was completely distorted, and it wasn't even firsthand. He was taking comments made by second and third hand listeners who themselves were incompetent in the art of listening. You see, and they don't have the academic background, and they don't even understand the word locution. You see, so what I'm trying to say here, Brother Karim, is that your perspective is welcomed into this venue, my venue, where because I'm dealing with an awful lot of people who have no academic background, and my own academic background is limited. You see, I don't have formal training other than as a medical doctor. Now that has its own discipline and its own science and its own approach to the sciences, but it's not the broad spectrum literary background that you have to any academic assessment of Islam. And what I have been able to do, I've done on my own momentum, having been dropped into ISTAC as a research fellow, as if I was a paratrooper dropped behind enemy lines, you see, just because I wrote a book on the Trinity. Now, I tried to take an academic approach to that, but look, I tell people I'm just a newspaper reporter and news deliverer. All I'm doing is I'm just telling you what I found. You see, when as I read through the material without any academic training, this is what I found. So this is what I put in my books, and maybe I have some academic acumen, but not to the degree that I welcome and I see and appreciate in your approach. This approach, which you're taking to the subversion, what we call the subversion of Islam, because that's what's happened. Literally, it's been subverted from within and obviously by forces without. And we know that took place. It began even during the Prophet's time. It began with the Jews in Medina, you see. And the moment that their chief rabbi converted, hey, they decided they had to stop this thing, you see. And of course, the prophet confronted them, and this was a very bloody event in the long run. But what people don't appreciate is that the Jews in Medina were the only ones with a castle. You see, they actually had a castle there. They were the power, they were the elitist there. And this is not really truly reflected in the histories that I've read of the Sunnah, of the early Islamic histories. But when the prophet makes the mention that Gog is breaking through the wall, it started there. It started right there. You see, because what Gog represents is organized evil, and Magog represents those who follow the organized evil. And what we're going to talk about here in this discussion, I'm ready to hand the floor to you, just with that introduction, because what you're describing is a systematic description of this organized evil. You see, this is how it's done, and here are the steps. And last week you gave us 4 steps, and I invite you to review those and then add your other steps, the intermediate levels, you see, so that people can appreciate what has happened and what has gone into this thing that we call traditionalism, which is not an accurate reflection of the Islam that was handed to Muhammad, our beloved prophet, alayhi salam. Now, if you can do that, dear brother, I really appreciate that, or at least make an attempt to do it, and to identify along the way, as Allah leads, inshallah, um, historical moments, just like I've mentioned here, these historical moments, because people need to anchor these abstract concepts to something that really happened that will help the student to make this approach to revisionism relevant and also helps to make Islam relevant. And when they say, oh, this is what happened, well, you see, how do you correct a mistake? You have to understand it. And when you're doing the detective work, you have to identify the motive and the modus operandi, why people did it. That's the motive. And what happened? What were the results? You see, who did it? This is a detective story. Who done it? You see. Well, I just identified one component, the Jews in Medina. Now, they didn't just walk away from Medina and leave this thing alone. Not by a long shot. Not by a long shot. But this is not discussed, you see. And the Bible refers to them and the Quran refers to them as Jews who are not Jews. You see, well, what does that mean? You see, that's subject for another discussion. But in any case, I've just identified a group of people in a moment where the prophet refers to them. Oh, well, Gog's already broken through. They're breaking through the wall. And what is this wall? A literal wall? Well, Darius might have built some sort of a wall there between the Black and the Caspian Sea sometime in millennia ago. And we see remnants of a literal wall there, but it has no brass in it. It has none of these components. It's just an old mud brick wall and maybe some rocks in between mountains and all that sort of thing. And there are descriptions for this, but what we're talking about is a metaphysical wall, you see. And this wall is the protection of Allah. And that protection that comes from Allah, that refuge that comes from Allah, is conditional. And it's conditional upon our submission and obedience to the truth, not to a lie. You see. So this is what's happened to Islam. Muslims have submitted to a lie and allowed Gog to come in and take over. We have evidence for this in ISIL. We have evidence for this in Afghanistan. It's all over the Middle East. I just say one word: Freemasonry. That's evidence. It's all over the Middle East. Quiet. It wasn't so quiet 100 years ago, but it is now, you see. In any case, without Freemasonry, this international thing we call the New World Order would not have come into existence. This is already academically qualified by a writer from the University of South Carolina in Raleigh. A lady there, Dr. I've forgotten her name, traced the whole history of Freemasonry to establish the British Empire. That's why we're all speaking English, isn't it? Of course it is. Of course it is. So, using this lingua, English, anglais, or whatever they say in the French, you see, we're discussing what happened to the world. We're discussing what happened to Islam. We're discussing the subversion of Islam by the same influence that Muhammad identified as Gog. And we're identifying tradition as Magog, the followers of Gog, you see. So, brother, with having said that, and not lightly, okay, I hand the floor over to you to take us wherever it is that Allah wants to take us now in this hour.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Brother Omar, and Assalamu alaikum again, and thank you for this opportunity to share some thoughts on this issue. Before I begin, can you just give me a couple of seconds? I have to turn off that fan. I forgot to switch it off. Otherwise,
of course, go right ahead. Do whatever you got to do. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there we go. And yeah, I also would like to mention that I appreciate this opportunity to share these thoughts with you and your listeners, because these are some questions that I have been actually struggling with for some years, actually, and trying to pin down the whole thing and do a proper analysis as to what happened. Because when I read Bernard Lewis's paper called What Went Wrong, as I mentioned before, I found it quite unsatisfactory. There's also a book by Omar Chapra about the decline of the Muslim civilization, It's
Hmm.
worth reading, but I think he also doesn't go far enough, or perhaps I should say deep enough, as to the root of the problem. So
Hmm.
now, I remember in a last meeting I mentioned that what do you call it, that moment of truth, when that word eclipse popped into my brain.
Yes, yes.
And I realized that this was the root. This was the major turning point when the hadith came between us and the Quran, or the tradition came between us and the Quran, on the pretext that it was going to explain the Quran, complete the Quran, and make it more coherent.
Hmm.
Be- because the traditional ulama basically made three assertions about the Quran, none of which actually is in agreement with the Quran says about itself. And these three assertions were that the Quran contained unclear or ambiguous words and verses,
Hmm.
while the Quran says that it is a clear book, Haza Kitabun Mubin. Secondly, they allege that the Quran is incomplete because it doesn't have details on how to pray in it, the physical prostrations and what have you. And they made this assertion despite the Quran presenting itself as a complete book. We have left out nothing from the book, and it is an explanation of everything. Kulli shay is the Arabic term. And finally, they allege that the Quran is also contains contradictory verses, and because they claim that there are some verses that contradict other verses, and this is also highly problematic, because it seems to imply that somehow Allah contradicted himself, and that is very difficult to believe. We consider Allah Ta'ala to be perfect, therefore his book is also perfect, it is flawless and inimitable. Yet the allegations of these flaws or weaknesses were basically used to enable the tradition to come in and begin to interpret, quote unquote, but rather what the Quran. But what happened in the process of this interpretation, actually, the book was misinterpreted, and the major corruption, one of the major corruptions that I see in the interpretations of the scholars, is what I have referred to as this transformation of the religion of peace into a religion of war. I have a book on
Yes.
that, and
This is a
so
major point, a major error.
yeah, massive, because you see, it explains to some extent why some Muslims, wayward Muslims, take to violence and try to do things, and they are thinking that they are doing it in the name of Islam, and that they are doing this to please Allah, and they even feel that they will earn 72 virgins in paradise by doing it. Now, some ulama have. Yeah, go ahead.
Can I just
Go ahead.
interpose
Go
here?
ahead.
I've always said that any man who wants 72 virgins is out of his mind.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that's a little bit of a. I mean, even the prophet allegedly was what he had, this 9 times thing. I don't know. I don't want to get into that, because again,
Yes,
some of these traditions have actually said things about the prophet that are not very flattering, and they do not
hmm,
portray him in a very good light. So that's another
yes,
problem we have with
yes,
the tradition. So, but anyway, as I was saying, so this reinterpretation of the Islam, which where the Quran teaches that Islam is a religion of peace, but the ulama teach that Islam is actually a religion of war, as Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi put it, and he's on record for saying this publicly.
yes,
Islam has always been a religion of war.
yes.
And we have other people who support this. For example, Said Ramadan al-Bouti said, is on record for saying that the so-called aggressive jihad, or jihad al-talab, or offensive jihad, which requires the Muslim community to go on the offensive against non-Muslims once a year, every year, even when the non-Muslims are not attacking the Muslims. This is the meaning of jihad al-talab, or offensive jihad.
Mm-hmm.
Now, they have elaborated this pernicious doctrine despite the verse in Al-Quran, verse 119, Surah Al-Baqarah, which says clearly that Allah does not love aggressors. And of course,
Hmm.
they developed this doctrine also. By the way, they developed it on the basis of the doctrine of abrogation, because these
Hmm.
ulama, I call them the militant ulama, claim that
Hmm.
a single verse, verse number 5 in Surah number 9, Tawbah, abrogated up to 120 other verses, all of which are talking about peace and reconciliation. So
Mm-hmm.
it is by means of this alleged abrogation of the peace verses by the verse of the sword, as it is sometimes called, that they transform this religion of peace into a religion of war. But think about the significance of what they're asking us to believe. First, they're asking us to stop believing in 120 verses of the Quran. Yet
Mm-hmm.
at the same time, you will find sometimes the very same people telling us that if someone disbelieves in a single verse, that makes him a disbeliever, an apostate. Yet here they're asking us to stop believing in 120. Okay, so what do you make of that? And not only that, it gets worse. What are they
Mm-hmm.
what are they implying about the Quran and about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when they make this allegation? Well, first they are indicating to us that Allah contradicted himself up to 120 times. Yeah, that he was not all clear in his when he revealed these verses. This is just unbelievable. And that he abrogates his own words as if he were saying that is like a human attribute, a human quality, to change one's mind. They're asking us to believe that Allah changed his mind, that he no longer wants us to consider Islam as a religion of peace, but now he wants us to consider Islam as a religion of war. Now, how did this happen? And the result was the articulation of the doctrine of jihad al-talab. And by the way, who was at the forefront of supporting this doctrine of abrogation?
Please tell us.
But yes, I will mention there was none other than Imam al-Shafi, who,
Mm-hmm.
out of the four leading imams, was the only one who openly supported the doctrine of jihad al-talab based on doctrine of abrogation of the peace verses by the verse of the sword. So I'm shocked that hundreds of millions of people in the world are following the teaching of this person who has been arguing, along with others, in favor of this offensive jihad or jihad al-talab. So now how do I put this? If you really look at it closely, I think you may conclude, as I did, that I don't see a whole lot of difference between jihad al-talab, offensive jihad, and basically state terrorism. When a whole community goes on the offensive against people who are not attacking it, what do you call that? I mean, I'm shocked. Now, I would like to mention, in addition, that Yusuf al-Qaradawi published recently a book called Fiqh of Jihad 2009, and it's a book, and in it, basically, he begins to backpedal on this whole doctrine of jihad al-talab and says basically that the traditional scholars got it wrong, that actually the Quran does not support this aggressive jihad or jihad al-talab. But he does it in a very, very gentle manner, as people like Rashid Ghanouchi observes. You can find a book review by him online of that book. So even al-Qaradawi admits that this whole concept of jihad al-talab was a mistake. By the way, Yusuf al-Qaradawi is not entirely free of, responsibility for some of the excesses perpetrated by some of the Muslims, because wasn't it he who issued a fatwa some years ago that it was okay for Palestinians to blow themselves up among Israeli civilians?
Oh, goodness me.
Exactly. Now, how much damage has that caused? He
Oh,
tried to
God
defend himself.
Almighty.
He tried to defend himself by saying that he only allowed it. Now, who is he to allow what Allah prohibited?
Yeah.
I'm amazed. He tried to defend himself by saying that he only permitted it for the Palestinian people. Does he really think? Exactly. Right.
It's
So
demonic. Yes.
he's going to permit what Allah prohibited. So does he have the power to overrule what Allah said? Allah prohibited taking a human life without just cause, and that is not a just cause. The so-called, So this is later on he retracted his fatwa, but a lot of damage has already been done. You see. So it's kind of ironic, but I suppose it's better late than never that this critique of
Allah
jihad
have mercy
al-Talabi
on him.
coming from me, but at least it's a step in the right direction.
Yes.
Another paper I would recommend for viewers if they want to pursue this topic of aggressive jihad a little further is a paper by Niaz A. Shah, that's S-H-A-H. The paper has been published by the European Journal of Islamic Law and republished by Oxford University Press. And the paper is available online, free in PDF format, and the name of the paper is Use of Force in Islamic Law. Another worthwhile worthwhile source to look into would be to look into a book called Tackling Takfiri Theology, published by the Quilliam Foundation in the United Kingdom. And the book was written by Saleh Ansari and Usama Hassan. Usama Hassan has written articles for The Guardian, and the paper is edited. The editors of the book are Adam Dean and Majid Navas. They also go into this issue. Actually, the book is an examination of the Jihad Manual of ISIS, the ISIS organization, and they go into detail and explain how and where these ISIS people got it wrong. And so I think that's a very thoroughgoing account and rebuts this ideology of Takfiri terrorism quite strongly.
Yeah.
So yeah.
If I can just interpose here a minute, I want our listeners to understand that Dr. Karim is not standing alone in his perspective. This is a systematic revelation of others who support this position from an academic perspective. So this is not just an opinion. This is a collection of opinion of scholars who are taking another very, very critical view of Islamic history, Islamic jurisprudence, Islamic doctrine. And what Professor Karim is doing for us here is summarizing very, very well-founded positions by scholars who are taking a look in the mirror and saying, my God, we've made a mistake. And this is where we made the mistake. This is how we made the mistake. This is why we made the mistake. We cannot permit this mistake to go unchallenged. Alhamdulillah. May Allah reward you and your colleagues for doing this work, dear brother.
Yeah, thank you, Brother Omar. Just a minor corrections here. Thank you for addressing me as a doctor, and I felt very good when I heard that. But I don't have a doctoral degree, so please don't. Yeah.
Yeah. I've been accused of having doctorates in several disciplines, and I don't hold them either. So I'm a doctor of medicine. That's
well,
but us protein students, you see, we tend to once we leave the institutions that prepared us to actually read, which is what Jibril told the prophet to do. We continue reading, and we don't stop reading. And if you attend the Dons at Oxford, what do you like? Well, you talk to the students there. They introduce themselves and say, "Well, what are you reading?" And they say, "Well, I'm reading philosophy. I'm reading ancient history. I'm reading Latin. I'm reading Mesopotamian, languages. Oh, what are you reading?" You see, and each of us, as students, as eternal students, as protean students, I like this word protean because you're kind of self-motivated on behalf of fitra, which Allah has placed in you to begin with, you see. So the more we read, the more we gain this knowledge, and over a period of time and over a period of years, we actually come to know more than many people who call themselves doctors, you see. Or
yes,
yes,
go
go
ahead.
ahead. No,
No,
I'm finished. I've said what I had to say.
I was just going to say, half playfully, that I could perhaps make a claim to having doctored some text, because as an editor, I have doctored, so to speak,
Yes.
a lot of text. So I have some expertise in that. But of course,
Yes.
doctoring text is a very, very delicate matter, because you can, of course, you try to improve the text, but never ever at the cost of changing or corrupting the meaning of the text. So that is definitely a very important consideration. By the way, my picture froze in my computer. I don't know. Is everything okay with the application?
I think so. We're still hearing you, and
Okay.
there's no problem. Has my picture froze?
No, you are quite
I'm
alive,
fine.
but I'm sort of like frozen
Okay.
in time.
Yeah, it's probably on your area. If
Maybe
you
what I can turn
sometimes
it
when
off.
that happens, there's a lack of memory. Uh,
Oh yeah,
you might need
yeah.
to free up some memory.
No, what I did was I switched off and on the camera. Now it's back on. That's good.
Okay,
Okay.
there you go. All right.
So yeah, so
Alhamdulillah.
Yeah,
So,
alhamdulillah.
in any case, I was telling the people that you're not standing alone. And that
Yeah,
goes the same for me. I'm not standing alone in my approach to this revisionist movement. Okay. And we're not necessarily at war with traditionalism. However, we are criticizing it. And we are criticizing it from a position of being well informed, you see. And what we're saying is that those who are holding to the traditional position and who are claiming that they're informed have been educated on a false foundation, you see, to begin with. And if you start with a false foundation and you continue to build up on it, which is what's happened over the last 1200 years, you get a, how shall we say, you become cemented in this position, you become concretized in the position of error.
yeah,
And then you want to defend this. And this is a position of what we might say is confirmation bias, and as well as of profound ignorance. Because what we're saying is there are things that you don't know, that you don't know, you don't know. And people who have this particular kind of ignorance become arrogant, you see. And then they want to defend themselves to the point of murder. And that's what we're discussing here because this system has justified Islam on this position of war being a religion of war, offensive war. Okay. And it is not. And these hadiths, which have been used to justify this, are not truthful. They are not honest. They do not reflect the Quran. And so I'm not standing alone in this. And Brother Karim is not standing alone in this at all. There is a legion of unknown people, unread scholars standing behind us. And if we're here and you're looking at our visage on this internet thing, we're standing on their shoulders. Not just we're not standing on our own feet. We're standing on their shoulders by Allah's leave and with Allah's permission, you see. And we're asking you to take another look at this traditionalist history. It's not what it's made out to be. And Brother Karim can tell you why. And please, brother, continue to tell us why it is not what it is made out to be. Inshallah.
right. So yeah, just to go right back to the beginning, where did it all begin? Of
Yeah.
course, we had the revelation of the Quran with the Prophet, and things were good while he was with us. I mean, with the people. But then, after his passing, two camps developed. One was called what can be thought of as the rationalists, people who believed in using reason or the akal to understand the Quran or revelation, while the other camp was the Ahlul Hadith, or the people who believed that we should see the Quran through the lens of tradition. In other
Mm.
words, that we should adopt the opinions of the Sahaba and our predecessors in our understanding of the Quran. In other words, the second group basically advocated what is known as taqlid, or blind following of tradition, which actually proved in a long term very devastating to the Muslim community, as we will see shortly. But the sort of assault on the reason began. I believe it started from the conflict between these two camps, who may also be said to correspond roughly to the school of Abu Hanifa and Imam al-Shafi. Imam Abu Hanifa apparently himself was quite rationalist. It was only after his passing that his school of thought was, as it were, hijacked by more pro traditional people and
Mm.
made less as it were less rational, let's say, and became more closer to the school of thought of Imam al-Shafi, the traditionalist school. So yeah, this tension between the rationalists and the traditionalists, Taha Jabir Al-Wani in his book called Reviving the Balance 2017 triple IT, which I also recommend, is also available online in PDF format. He described the struggle between the two groups as a battlefield. And in this battlefield, basically, the Ahlul Hadith, I believe, came up with a hadith according to which the Prophet allegedly said that, I quote, I was given two things, the Quran and something equal to it, the hadith in the brackets. And there was another hadith that they came up with, and that was the hadith according to which the use of reason-based tafsir was a form of kufr. And this concept was also expressed in a saying, the Arabic term is al-fikr kufr, meaning this concept is suggesting to us that the very act of thinking can lead us to become disbelievers. And I would like, yeah, exactly. So in other words, I would like to emphasize the second hadith first. Is more relevant for the beginning part of this chain of effects, causes and effects, because this hadith had an impact on a debate between the rationalists and the traditionalists. Some people everyone wanted to be a good Muslim, of course, but if you believe this, that the Prophet prohibited reason-based tafsir, and by the way, there are at least two other hadiths on this issue. You can find them, for example, mentioned on page 178 in Abdul Said's book called The Quran, The Interpretation of the Quran. The book is also available on online. One of the hadiths basically says that anyone who expresses his opinion about the Quran has made a mistake, even if his opinion was correct. And there's another second hadith very similar to that. Now, these hadiths have the effect of discouraging thinking, and they, I think, led some of the Muslims to reduce their reliance on their own reason. I don't want to go so far as to say that they stopped thinking. I don't think that's possible. But they began to distrust their own reason, and they began to turn elsewhere for guidance. Rather than try to understand the Quran by themselves, they would turn to their ulama and imams to give them guidance as to what exactly the Quran is intending to say. So the first effect of this adopting this hadith or believing in this hadith was a reduced reliance on reason, which soon led to the subordination of reason to tradition, the subordination of akl to nakl, which is a well-known phrase also in Islamic jurisprudence. This notion that we have to subordinate our reason to tradition basically tells us that we have to follow even the weakest tradition, even when it is against reason or when it is illogical. So if somebody tells me that I should have a cup of, camel urine, but my doctor tells me, maybe you are a doctor, that you shouldn't do it because it may not be good. According to this line of reasoning, I should not follow your advice, but I should follow the hadith, because the hadith is a higher authority than reason or science in this case. So this was a very problematic development. And also I could add, I'm very surprised that the traditionalists were willing to throw reason under the bus so readily, in light of the fact that in the very process of authenticating traditions into various classes like authentic, sahih, hadith, hasan, weak, and fabricated, they relied on the reason to make this classification. So after they were done with this classification, where the reason was the arbiter, so to speak, then they decide to subordinate reason to the very traditions that the reason authenticated. So there's another inconsistency here. But another effect of the reduced reliance on the reason resulting from this besmirching of reason or rationality was that Muslims began to, I believe, misunderstand the Quran, those that were reading it. Because you can never understand anything fully, and that includes the Quran, unless you use your mind. Hence, we have people who have written books like The Closing of the Muslim Mind, written by Robert Riley, who is not a Muslim, by the way, but he borrowed the title from another title, The Closing of the American Mind, which was actually written by one of my former professors, Alan Bloom. And So Riley wrote a similar book, and then in response to Riley's book came the book by Mustafa Kio, just published last year, called Reopening the. And we also have another book called The Crisis in the Muslim Mind, 1993, triple IT, written by Abdul Hamid Abu Sulaiman, also well worth reading. So the result of this belittling of reason, of the marginalization of reason, was that the Quran became elusive, that the readers began to misunderstand the Quran. And this is why they began to encounter words and passages or verses that struck them as unclear. They struck them as unclear or ambiguous because they were not using their reason to its full potential. Similarly, I would suggest that the reason why they, asserted that the Quran is missing some parts like details on how to pray is also partly a consequence of insufficient application of the use of reason. And ditto for the allegation that the Quran contains contradictory verses. All these alleged contradictions, and by the way, the scholars do not agree on which verses contradict other verses or how many of them are there. The total number of abrogated verses. The number ranges from a low of 5, according to Shah Waliullah, to up to as many as 500 verses that some ulama claim were abrogated by other verses. So there's no ijma or consensus on this. By the way, as Muhammad Asad points out in his footnote, comment on footnote 106, which is taken to be about abrogation in Al-Quran, Surah Al-Baqarah, there's not a single tradition in the entire corpus of the Hadith which confirms the doctrine of abrogation. But enough about that. So the result of the belittling of reason and the marginalization of reason of the aql, the human mind, the immediate consequences were reduced reliance on reason and the beginning of the misunderstanding of the Quran. So suddenly the people were they wanted the guidance. I believe this is I don't see why we cannot readily accept that yes, they did want guidance, but since they were not getting it from the Quran, they began to turn somewhere else. And where did they turn to? They turned to the Hadith, you see. Now, there was this was the first stage of the 4 major stages, was the belittling of reason and its subordination to tradition, based on the Hadith that the Prophet forbade reason-based tafsir. So now the second stage in this whole process was the what I called the elevation of tradition to the rank of revelation, to a level of equality.
Yes.
With revelation. And I in an earlier discussion on Clubhouse, I used the metaphor of a race. Imagine there's a race. There are 4 runners in it, and they are called reason, tradition, revelation, and I will leave the last one for the moment unnamed. So what is happening here is that they are starting, and what is happening in the first stage is that the runner called tradition is overtaking the runner called reason. Right now he's ahead of him. But this runner called tradition is very fast, and next he comes and he's on par now with revelation. They are running side by side, equally. And then in a third stage, the runner called tradition overtakes the runner called revelation, and now he is looks like he may win the race. Yes. Suddenly, the 4th runner appears on the scene and overtakes all 3 other runners and wins the race. Yeah, exactly. Now, who is this last runner, the 4th runner? Well, the 4th runner is none other than the ulama, you see. And I say that because the ulama declared that they have the power to abrogate the Quran and also the Sunnah, you see. Yes. So they declared themselves basically to be the highest authority, higher even than the authority of the Quran and the Sunnah, you see, as John Esposito put it in one of his papers online. He said, Ijma overrules everything, right? So that becomes the highest authority. So we have an inversion, as it were, of the ranking of the roots of the Sharia, as we find in Al-Shafi, who placed the Quran at the top, followed by the Sunnah, and then followed by Ijma. Now we have a reversal of this ranking. We have Ijma at the top, followed by the Sunnah, followed by the Quran. The Quran ends up in 3rd place. Now, is this consistent with monotheism, and is this consistent with maintaining the sovereignty and the supremacy of Allah?
No, not at all. If I can interject here, because I want to draw a parallel based on what you've just described, this race, so that the one who won the race, we would call them the ulama, and in the ancient world they were called priests.
Yeah.
and we can liken them to the Catholic Church, who calls itself a priesthood and is governed by a priesthood. Now, this ultimate authority is none other than the papacy, you see, and the papacy is traced to Babylon, and the last well-known representative of the Babylonian papacy is the one we call Nimrod. Now, he had other names, but we'll just call him Nimrod right now, or Nimrod. This is the one, the king apparently, who Ibrahim approached and had an exchange of opinions with, and Nimrod he refused to accept Islam because he would have to give up his perks, you see, as king. Now, and this is fairly well stated in Al Quran, but what people don't know is that the occult side of Nimrod's position is that of the priesthood. He was king priest, you will see. And as priest, he was called the Petar, P E apostrophe T A R. And he was the ultimate interpreter of anything that was considered to be divine, scripture wise or otherwise. It doesn't make any difference. You see, he was the ultimate interpreter, and he held a set of keys. You see, and in the Catholic Church, you see these keys are kind of like in a cross whenever you have the papal seal. They're held there as a set of keys, and these can also be likened to the Pharaoh's rod of authority and whatnot, because of its authority on earth and authority in heaven, you see. So the Petar had the power to bind on earth what was already bound in heaven. And this is the essence of the priesthood. Now, we have the outward priesthood, which you can say is the ulama, but we also have the hidden priesthood. And those are the ones who practice the black magic, if you will, the magi and the sorcerers that Al Bukhari warned us about. And that the Prophet, if this hadith is to be believed, his letter to Khosru warned about. He said, become Islam, accept Islam, or you will be responsible for what? The sins of the Magi, you see. Now, this is what we're discussing here because these are the same people that infiltrated Islam and put this system of Gog in place within Islam itself. That is my position as I listen to you and hear what you have to say and compare it to what I have learned from other sources. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Yeah. So just to mention one other point that about the change, the transformation of Islam from a religion of peace to a religion of war. How
Yes.
did you how did the ulama do that? Well, they
Mm.
basically, as I mentioned earlier, by recourse to the doctrine of abrogation, but they did it in a kind of way that they made it look as if Allah Himself was responsible for the transformation of Islam
Hmm.
religion into religion of war, because they claim that it was Allah Himself who abrogated those 120 peace verses and upheld the verse of the sword in their stead, you see. But
Hmm.
I don't believe that was Allah's intention at all. I think they were just using that as a, how do I put it, a strategy to put the blame for this transformation on Allah or responsibility, so that they would look like they had nothing to do with it. But I think they had everything to do with it, because Allah
Yes.
Ta'ala has never given any authority for this doctrine of abrogation, and the
Hmm.
very notion that He would cancel the verses of the on peace and reconciliation, all 120 of them, and thereby kind of contradict Himself, I think is totally absurd. The ulama wanted to change the religion of peace into a religion of war. Why? Well, some, as Muhammad Shahrur points out in his book called Qur'an, Morality and Critical Reason, in chapter 6, which is on politics, some of the rulers of the Muslim communities at that time wanted a religious justification to go on and wage jihad al-talab on the neighboring communities, but they wanted to make it look like they were doing it in the service of Islam, you see. So this is where the articulation of the doctrine of jihad al-talab and the abrogation of the peace verses on which it rests, I think, came about. So it was the ulama who wanted to, as it were, appease their rulers, who were in the pay of the rulers, who provided this reinterpretation of Islam from a religion of peace into a religion of war in order to provide an ideological rationale or justification for waging wars of expansion and expanding the empire. And as you know, Muslims had several empires, one in Spain, which was stopped by Charles Martel in France. Yes. Then we had the Umayyad Empire that was finished off by the Abbasid Empire. Then we have Abbasid Empire itself was finished off by the Mongols. And the Turkic Empire was finished off after they attacked in an aggressive way Vienna twice, and once again they were defeated in both occasions, completely in line with the dictum in the Qur'an that Allah does not love aggressors. In each of these four cases I mentioned, the Muslim community aggressed against another nation and suffered defeat as a result. Same thing can be said about the action of Saddam Hussein in the last two wars that he waged against Kuwait and Iran. He was also defeated. So, and I want to also mention one incident, the so-called slaughter of the philosophers in 786 by Musa al-Hadi.
Yes, tell us.
You see, this was a political attack on reason, and you were mentioning that it would be good to know some historical event, and this is it.
Yes, please.
The slaughter of the 5,000 philosophers in 786 was actually a continuation of the persecution of thinkers that already began under the Umayyads, who, under Marwan, persecuted people who believed in freedom, freedom of the will in particular, and these people were known at that time as Qadarites. And Marwan beheaded their leader in 699 because he allegedly promoted the idea of the freedom of the will. So this was I believe, the beginning of rise of despotism in the Muslim world, an attack.
So you could say that Marwan was the first Jesuit.
It could be, yeah.
Yeah.
So now this attack on freedom, by the way, continued in the next century with an attack this time on reason also. And that is when the death of the 5,000 philosophers came in, you see, because actually the attack on the philosophers was an attack both on freedom and reason, because these philosophers were, and by the way, Suyuti refers to this event, and so does Tabari. And the Suyuti reference is repeated for us by Jamaluddin al-Afghani in his debate with Renan, and you can find the reference to this debate in a book called Modernist Islam, published by Oxford University Press, edited by Charles Kurzman, and the reference is located in the article on Jamaluddin al-Afghani. Most traditional Muslims don't know about this event. Even I found about it only recently, because the traditionalists almost never mention this, and maybe they don't mention
Where
it.
Where did this take place again?
It happened in Iraq. In
Iraq.
Yeah. So 5,000 thinkers were slaughtered, although Suyuti admits that the number may have been, Afghani admits the number may have been somewhat exaggerated, but people agree that this event did happen. And by the way, I could also mention in passing that when a single philosopher was put to death in the Western world, his name was Socrates, there was a huge outcry.
Yes, yes.
You can hear complaints about this injustice until to this day. For more than 2 millennia, people are complaining, how could such a decent and just man be treated so badly? So there's a huge outcry. One philosopher. So my question is, the outcry at the death of 5,000 philosophers should be at least 5,000 times greater. But my question, where is the outcry? I want to know. Because I don't hear too much of this outcry at all. In fact, I hear sometimes people applauding this event and saying, well, it was the right thing to do because they were free thinkers. So this was their crime, that they were thinkers. And so they are known as the Zindiks or Zandaka, you see.
Yes, I've heard this word, yeah.
Yeah. So they were accused of a crime, an act that is not identified as a crime in the Quran. thinking or freedom or free thinking. So this was a major blow to the rationalists, and probably many gifted individuals died, and thoughtful people died in this massacre. I sometimes compare it to the Reign of Terror that happened approximately 1,000 years later in revolutionary France during the Reign of Terror under the
Yes.
Jacobins, whose head
Yes.
was Maximilien Robespierre. It's
Yes.
just that
Yes.
in that case, 16,000 people were slaughtered at the guillotine. And what
Yes.
was their crime? Their crime was that they were not sufficiently rational or reasonable. So you see here in Europe, we see the rationalists dishing it out to the traditionalists, the supporters of the monarchy, while in a Muslim world, 1,000 years earlier, the tables are reversed, and it is the rationalists who are on the receiving end and getting punished by the traditionalists, you see. So this whole tension, so to speak, if you want to think of it, or relationship between reason and revelation was resolved in both places at different times in the Muslim world and through political means, in other words, through brute force and repression.
Yes.
In the Muslim world, it was resolved in favor of tradition, while in the Western world, 1,000 years later, it was resolved in favor of reason, because we think of the French Revolution as part of the so-called Age of Enlightenment, Age of Reason, and then we have the separation of church and state and secularism and what have you. So did we have a sort of reign of terror also in early Islam at the time when the 5,000 philosophers were slaughtered? That would be one way to put the question. But anyway, so what I wanted to say is that the attack on the philosophers was an attack both on freedom and reason, right? And that was the political manifestation of this. Now, there was further manifestations of the assaults on reason in the history afterwards. We had a so-called golden period under Ma'mun after Harun al-Rashid, which ended in 852 by Mutawakkil, who brought back the policy of upholding tradition once again. Al-Ma'mun began his reign, I believe, in 809. So the reign of the Mutazilites, as they were known, the rationalists, was relatively short. And so then when Mutawakkil came to power, the persecution of thinkers began all over again. Their books were burned. They were banished. Some of them were killed, and this went on for some time. And then there's a good book also by a Pakistani scientist. His name is the name of the book is Islam and Science, and the name of the author is Pervez Hoodbhoy. That's Hoodbhoy. It's available in PDF format, and he gives an excellent account of these various persecutions that took place by traditionalists in the early days of Islam. So the next blow against reason came with the so-called closure of the gates to ijtihad at the turn of the millennium, around year 1000, when the jurists, there was even an official edict by one of the caliphs which prohibited jurists or the fuqaha from doing any more ijtihad or juristic reasoning. It was assumed that the jurists solved all the problems of the Sharia for all time to come, which was really an amazing position to take, because they obviously had no idea of any of the modern developments that we have now: internet, submarines, airplanes, transportation, globalization, and what have you. So the last blow against rationality came in the work of Imam al-Ghazali when he wrote his book, the Tahafut al-Falasafa, the Incoherence of the Philosophers. So we see here in early Muslim history a systematic and sustained, assault on the reason and rationality, with the worst political manifestation taking place in the form of the purge of the killing of the 5,000 philosophers by Musa al-Hadi. So this is how orthodoxy was established, basically, in the Muslim world. And the supremacy of tradition over reason, basically through brute force, at least in the early days. Now we see some application of force even today when dissenting voices like that of Rashid Khalifa, for example, are labeled as apostates, and some people take it upon themselves to murder these people, and some people have died as a result of such fatwas. In fact, the ulama had a habit of saying that anyone who disagrees with us has left the fold of Islam. Now, you know what that means. That means that they become apostates that have to be killed. So, is this the right way to propagate the orthodox perception of Islam by threatening to kill anyone who disagrees with the ulama? I mean, to me, that reminds me of the way the mafia operates, you see.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
And the requirement to kill apostates also reminds me of the way the mafia operates, because these secret organizations have a rule. It's called omerta, the rule of silence, that
Mhm.
they, if you leave, they will try to kill you because you could rat on the police to them, to the police on them. You see.
Yeah. Well,
So
this has to do with the concepts of loyalty and disloyalty, and this sort of thing. Uh, Brother, I think we should probably come to an end here. We're going to
yeah,
exhaust our listeners for this
sure,
hour, but
sure.
I would like to take this persecution of the philosophers up and identify the times and the places, and
Yeah,
especially go in a little bit to Ghazali, because there's confusion regarding this man.
yeah, sure.
Um,
Yeah,
in my mind, as I listen to various students of Islam over the years, and professors and students, it doesn't make any difference. There's always some confusion. He's held in very high regard, and yet you're saying, okay, well, he has attacked uh, rationalism here.
yes,
And
certainly.
so I think this point should be pursued, and inshallah, let us do it again next week.
Yeah.
Brother Karim, you have a website, do you, or just a
Well,
YouTube channel? How do our listeners get in touch with you?
okay, I have a YouTube channel under my legal name, Leslie Terebesi. My books are listed, about 82 or 3 of them, on Amazon.com. I have my
Mm-hmm.
academic material, about 200 plus papers on academia, and I have
Mm-hmm.
the same work also on ResearchGate, but they are listed under my Muslim name, which is Abdul Karim Abdullah. I used to have 4 blogs. I think 2 or 3 of them are still active. I mean, I have not. I discontinued to use them, but for some reason, 2 or 3 of them still appear in the public domain. One of them is called leslieterebesi.com. The
Mm-hmm.
first one we used to be called abdulkarimabdullah.com, and then the third one is called islamicpapers.com. I think islamicpapers.com can still be found online, and leslieterebesi.com can
Mm-hmm.
also be found online. I tried to find
Very
Abdul
good.
Karim. So yeah,
Mm,
just Google my name, and
very
probably you
good.
will come across this.
Well, I'd like to link to some of these sites on my own website at elginko.com, and
Sure.
invite our listeners to join us in whatever form or way they can possibly do. And tune in to us again next week, because at this
Inshallah.
time next week, Tuesday again, if we
Okay.
can, we'll meet at 9 p.m. Kuala Lumpur time and 9 a.m. New York time. Of course, I'm
Uh,
not in New York, I'm in Kentucky,
ah,
old Kentucky, and they say
yeah.
in
Colonel
so
Sanders, please.
yes. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. May Allah keep you and yours in His good graces this coming week and thereafter and hereafter.
Yes, thank you,
All
brother.
to
Same to
you
you. Yeah.
and to our
Wa
listeners as well. Wassalamu alaikum.
alaikum salam. Thank you also. Salam.